Welcome to PCN's History and Culture podcast series. In this episode, we take a tour of the A Place for All exhibit at the Pennsylvania State Museum in Harrisburg. The exhibit tells the stories of 3 integration efforts in Pennsylvania in the years after World War II. Visit PCNselect.com to watch the full video tour.
Hello, my name is Curt Miner. I'm Chief of Interpretation and Senior History Curator here at the State Museum of Pennsylvania in Harrisburg. The State Museum is the official museum of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, and we are really the only museum in the Commonwealth that is charged to tell the full breadth of Pennsylvania history, both its natural history and human history, and we do that on 3.5 floors of gallery space here at the museum. One of our primary responsibilities here at the State Museum, especially for curators, is caring for the vast collections of the museum. We have, in the history side of things, about 500,000 objects. And most people probably don't realize when they come to a museum that at any given point in time, they're only seeing a very, very small percentage of the total collection. So when you come to the State Museum, you're seeing about 2% of the collection, but that 2% is really important. And that brings us to this special exhibit. It's titled A Place for All, 3 Stories of Integration in Pennsylvania. It's on exhibit here in the first floor of the State Museum, opened in June of 2022, and it's a long-term exhibition that visitors will be able to see here at the State Museum. This exhibit is actually a reprise of 3 small traveling exhibits that were organized in the early 2000s by my late colleague, Eric Liddell Smith. Eric was a specialist in African American history, and in the early 2000s, he came up with a proposal for a series of small exhibits that would focus on the history of the civil rights movement in Pennsylvania. The idea at the time was fairly novel because back then, even among American historians, the civil rights movement was largely thought of as a sectional story. So when you think of the history of civil rights in America after World War II, you think of places like Little Rock, Arkansas, and places like Greensboro, North Carolina, and famously Montgomery, Alabama, and the bus boycotts. You don't think of places like Levittown, Pennsylvania, which is in Bucks County, or the Highland Park swimming pool in Pittsburgh, or Girard College in Philadelphia. But Eric's argument was that those 3 places saw as much important activity in the struggle to end segregation as those more famous places and events. And it helps to tell a story that's not told, which is of the movement in the North. And his simple idea was that the idea of segregation and the institution of segregation did not end at the Mason-Dixon line. It traveled north. And he really wanted to tell that story. What we decided to do in 2020, after the events that summer, is to bring these exhibits back, but in a very different form. And we did 3 different things than we had done earlier. The first thing we decided to do is to take those 3 stories and put them on a much larger stage. Rather than a small traveling exhibit, we decided to put it here in the State Museum in a semi-permanent installation in about 2,500 square foot of space right off of our Memorial Hall. We thought this was a way that more people from Pennsylvania who visit the State Museum would be able to take in these very important stories. The second thing we decided to do is combine the stories. These were all important events that occurred in Pennsylvania in the 2 decades after World War II, but they did not occur in isolation. They were part of a movement. But it was a movement that changed over time. And by combining those 3 stories, we would be able to tell visitors about how the struggle to end segregation changed over time in very important ways, both in terms of the goals of the campaign to end segregation and in terms of the base for that support. It would often start very small with a few people, and over time it expanded into a mass movement. This new way of approaching this story allowed us to do that. The third thing we decided to do was to maintain Eric's approach to these stories by having them told from the perspective of the people who lived through them. This is not a distant past. It's taken place in living memory for many of the people who participated in these very important struggles to end segregation in Pennsylvania. It's not a story that came with a lot of traditional material that we, as museum curators, usually go back to, what we call the material culture. There is stuff in this exhibit, but this is not a kind of history that yielded a lot of material in three-dimensional ways, but it's still a very important story. So we had to rely on other tricks of our trade, which included interviews, first-person interviews or oral histories with those who were involved in this struggle, searching archives for important documents and photographs, which included audio-visual material that we had never used prior to this exhibition. And the last thing we tried to do to really bring this alive for people is to recreate in a very stylistic way these three environments where these stories took place, which were very different from each other, were a very important part of the story. And that's what we hope visitors can really absorb when they come to this exhibit, and they really find themselves immersed in the sources and in the stories of the people who live this experience. The first section of our exhibit tells a story of the integration of Levittown, Pennsylvania. Levittown, Pennsylvania is located in southeastern Pennsylvania in Bucks County. And in the 1950s, it was a fairly well-known place. That's because it was the second of what turned out to be three large housing developments built after World War II by a fellow named Bill Levitt. We have a Time magazine cover showing Bill Levitt on the cover. If you made the cover of Time magazine back in the 1950s and 1960s, you were doing something, either for good or for ill. And it could probably be argued that Bill Levitt did a little bit of both. He made the cover because in 1950, he was the largest home builder in the United States. It was thought that he built 1 out of every 5 homes. His first suburban development was on Long Island in New York between 1947 and 1951. Bill Levitt was responding to a crisis, but it wasn't a racial crisis in his mind, it was a housing crisis. Returning veterans after World War II were getting married, they were starting families, the famous baby boom, and those people needed homes. Bill Levitt came up with an idea. We can mass produce housing, much in the same way that Henry Ford mass produced the Model T. And he created his first development on Long Island. It satisfied the need for at least 17,311 home owners who would be built families from that. He did it in a very simple way, which is offering very limited choices and finding a way to mass produce construction so that in a matter of a few years, a cornfield or an asparagus field could be developed into a series of small neighborhoods with small houses that could pack in a lot of people. He completed Levittown, New York in 1951 and thought, I needed another development. So he turned to Pennsylvania and he found a location in Bucks County that was equidistant between Philadelphia and Trenton, New Jersey, and he began building homes. Between 1952 and 1958, he built 17,311 homes and attracted over 70,000 residents by the time it was completed. Had Levittown been incorporated as its own community, it would have been the 7th or 8th largest in Pennsylvania. And it was a major draw for veterans and their families. There was one asterisk, but it's an important one. Levittown attracted white residents, and that's because he specifically refused to sell to African Americans. His argument, and we have a direct quote from Bill Levitt, who is part of this story, is that we can solve the housing problem or we can solve the racial problem. We cannot combine the two. And his argument, which was very common back in the 1950s, is that if he were to sell one house to, quote, a Negro family, no other whites would buy in that neighborhood. That policy obtained from 1952 until 1957 and until August of that year, when a couple named Bill and Daisy Myers were able to purchase a house in the Dogwood Hollow section of Levittown. Levittown was made up of about 40 self-contained neighborhoods, and Dogwood Hollow is one of them. They found a house at 43 Deep Green Lake. And a question comes up: how did Bill and Daisy Myers, an African-American couple, purchase a house in a community that was segregated? Bill Levitt refused to sell to African-Americans. However, he did not control sales in the aftermarket, which is if you were an independent homeowner in Levittown, you were free to sell your house to whomever you wished. The Myers family were fortunate to have met the acquaintance of a fellow named Lou Wexler. Lou Wexler lived in Levittown. He was part of a small community of self-described race progressives who were very interested in integrating Levittown and worked very hard at it. They were looking for a couple that would be willing to step forward. Bill and Daisy Myers were that couple. And it's interesting because the argument was Bill and Daisy Myers were identical in every way to the standard demographic that was moving into Levittown after World War II. They were young. Daisy was college educated. Bill was a veteran of World War II. And they had 2.5 children, which is to say they had 2 small children and a third on the way, and they needed more space, which was the motivation for most people moving into homes in Levittown, is to raise their families. So they were able to purchase a house on the sly, if you will, through an acquaintance of Lou Wexler. And it was at that point that things began to change dramatically. When Bill and Daisy Myers first moved into their house, and this is in August of 1957, they caused no concern. That's because most people assumed this young black couple were actually the help. And it turned out, based on a newspaper story that would appear the next day in the Levittown Times, that they were in fact the first Negro family to move into Levittown. At that point forward, things begin to move very quickly for the Myers family. After they moved in on the 12th of August, a small crowd of, quote, curious onlookers stands and forms outside their home. That evening, someone throws a rock through the picture window of the home. The local police are called out to try to investigate, and what they encounter is a small crowd that then disperses. But what happens is, as things often do happen in this fashion, the small crowd becomes a larger crowd. And at night, over the course of the next several days, it grows and grows. This is a photograph we have in the lower center panel, of a guy named Ray Newell, who was a transplant from North Carolina, who had, according to reports, had expressly moved from North Carolina to Pennsylvania because he did not want to live among Negroes, in his words. So he ends up becoming the ringleader of the mob that forms outside of the Myers family home every evening with the express purpose of harassing the Myers family and forcing them to move. And that proceeds for the next several days until by the end of the week, things were getting to the point where it was clear that there was going to be some kind of major violent act. We have, in the state archives, we located a telegram that speaks to that. It's a telegram that's from the sheriff of Bucks County to Governor George Leader. Governor George Leader was the first Democrat elected to the governorship since World War II. He is obviously sympathetic to the cause of the Myers family, but he initially doesn't weigh in until he receives this telegram from a beleaguered sheriff of Bucks County imploring the governor to send out the state police to restore some level of calm in Levittown, which he does. Now, this is where I have to pause just briefly to bring back some context to this moment. It's August of 1957. Governor Leader is sending out the state police. In a matter of a few weeks, the national media, which is briefly focused on Levittown and the struggle to integrate this very recognizable housing development, that media attention shifts to a place called Little Rock, Arkansas. Same year, next month. What happens in Little Rock, Arkansas is almost the opposite of what's happening in Levittown, which is you have a governor who ends up calling out the equivalent of the state police to the National Guard in Little Rock, Arkansas, to prevent the integration of Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. Pennsylvania's governor is in the same position, but he calls out state power in order to provide peace and allow for the integration of Levittown, which does happen. But it's not without a lot of tension. As a result of the state police presence, the Myers family achieved what Daisy Myers called in a memoir that she wrote of these events, an uneasy peace. There's a wonderful photograph that we have, and we've relied on photographs that we found from a number of different news outlets, but I want to point your attention to one photograph in particular, which I think captures the moment. It's Daisy Myers with her daughter Linda staring out of her kitchen window, undoubtedly at the crowd that formed and continued to form until the county sheriff was actually able to get an injunction against the crowd and disperse the public demonstration in front of the house. So fortunately, the Myers family were then, after the 19th, able to finally move into their home after 1 week of incredible tension in the community. What's also interesting is the degree to which, as I've kind of alluded to, this captures the attention of the press and the media. We have it on display in this exhibit, a film that was made as the events were unfolding. It's called Crisis in Levittown. It was made by a New York film documentarian who came to Levittown because he was really interested in trying to understand what people in Levittown felt about this incident that had suddenly brought all this, I will say, largely unwanted attention on their small community. And what he found is that the community was divided into thirds. On the one side, I will say that on the left, were a small group of folks who were like-minded with Lou Wexler. They believed that Levittown should be integrated, and they believed that was an important point in public policy that had to be brought forward. On the other side, we had Jim Newell, the man with the bullhorn here, who were adamantly opposed. They were so opposed, they formed a group. It was called the Levittown Betterment Committee, if you can believe those words, with the express purpose of keeping Levittown white. And in the middle, which is really the largest segment, the vast middle, there were folks like Reverend Ray Harwick, who led a group called the Levittown Citizens Committee. It was a non-denominational group that was interested in restoring calm and peace to Levittown. And their position was this: the Myers families are good people. We think they have every right to move into Levittown. And we want the spotlight taken away from Levittown. So they had this position that was fairly common during that time, which is we think the Myers people are, quote, good Negroes. We're happy to have them as neighbors, but we do not believe Levittown should be integrated as a matter of policy. So they steered what they thought was a middle course, but it was certainly a divided community in 1957. So how does this situation resolve? Daisy Myers, in her words, noted, all we ever really wanted was a normal life. They were aspiring to the American dream of home ownership. They were able to achieve it, but it wasn't without a lot of resistance. And you got a sense, talking to Daisy Myers, that it was extremely difficult for her family because they were alone. And this is a very important point. The civil rights movement, as we think of it, is often thought of as as large groups of people affecting change, and that does happen. But in the early years, it was often change that was being affected by small groups, and sometimes single families, as is the case with Bill and Daisy Myers and their children. So from there, we now move from the living room to the kitchen, where we can follow the story. So I'm standing inside a kind of simulated kitchen in Levittown. It's the kitchen of Bill and Daisy Myers. And the photograph I'm sitting in front of is part of a profile, came from part of a profile of Bill and Daisy Myers that was published in Look magazine that fall. And it shows Bill Myers at the kitchen table with Ray Harwick, who was part of the Levittown Citizens Committee, who came to the aid of the Myers family. And the Myers family did credit this large community that came forward and published they signed petitions in support of the Myers family. The other thing that happened in the fall is that because of the national press, that the Myers family started receiving all sorts of interesting letters of support from people they didn't know from all over the country. And they felt that was a really important part of that story. So what we've done here is we've arranged some of the ephemera that Daisy Myers had saved from that time, which included lots of postcards and letters of support as a result of that profile in Look magazine. And she thought that was a really important part of the story. I thought it was interesting when we talked to Daisy Myers, what she didn't save. She didn't save what was probably coming through the mail as well, which were letters not of support, people who were still upset that the Myers family was living in Levittown and drawing more African American families there. But during the fall of 1957, the emphasis was on trying to create a sense of normalcy, which they were able to do because of, according to Daisy, the positive support they were getting from a lot of people from all over the country. One of my favorite pieces of, and this is where we rely on ephemera and the value of simple, seemingly ordinary documents. We have a bookshelf here we've set up with some more photographs of the Myers family, their children in the home, neighbors coming over, playing a game of charades, all things that people in the 1950s could certainly have related to. This is that sense of normalcy they were working hard to restore. But my favorite piece of material that Daisy had shared with us was this greeting card. And it's a common greeting card you would have sent back in the 1950s or 1960s to a new homeowner, saying basically, welcome to the neighborhood. In this case, the front of it says, best wishes to you and your new home. What's interesting to me is it came to the Myers family anonymously, and it's not signed, but there is a typewritten note at the bottom of the inside of the card that reads, good luck, don't let them chase you out. Signed, a friend. And Daisy saved that because I think it in some ways was emblematic of the type of support she was receiving over the course of the several months that fall. There were also some substantive things that happened that fall as well. In addition to Bill and Daisy Myers and their kids attending school, we have wonderful photographs of the boys riding their tricycles down the sidewalk, which would have been a common scene. The handful of people who were really driving the mob were brought to justice. There was a permanent injunction issued against the Betterment Association of Levittown, which was headed by Jim Newell. Jim Newell runs for office, thinking he still has political support. He's soundly defeated. In addition to the perpetrators of the harassment that fall being brought to justice in late 1957, another interesting development was the following year. That year, a second African-American family moves into Levittown, Ken and Julia Mosby. There's a photograph of them here in front of their Levittown home. And while they were not greeted with open arms, they did not encounter the crowds and the resistance that the Myers family did. That was a really important change. But I think the most important change was with Bill Levitt himself. Bill Levitt was a home builder. He was interested in making money. It was a business proposition for him, but he had also sensed that the times were changing. And what I think is most interesting, and I think a credit to this movement and the way it affected change, is that when Bill Myers, when Bill Levitt chose to build his third and final housing development, he sold to both whites and African Americans. He did not discriminate based on race. And that third development was literally across the Delaware in Willingboro, New Jersey. Bill and Daisy Myers stayed in Levittown for about 4 years. They left in 1961. But the experience of Levittown stayed with them, and it stayed with Daisy in particular. One of the things we found out after interviewing her is that during the course of the events of 1957, she started taking notes, and she started writing a manuscript. And what I thought was really interesting about this, and we have a copy of her manuscript in this case, is that Daisy thought something was happening. She didn't know quite what it was, but she thought it was important. And in her foreword to that manuscript, which she eventually was able to publish in the early 2000s, and actually in 2005, it's called Sticks and Stones, The Myers Family in Levittown. We have a copy of that in here as well. She wrote a foreword where she reflected back on this moment. And for this exhibit, we pulled out a particular passage which I thought was really telling. Quote, "I started writing text for what would become this book in August 1957 before I knew how the narrative would turn out. The civil rights movement had started and I felt we were part of the story." And I think when you read that, you really are struck with the immediacy of this moment for people like Bill and Daisy Myers. We think of the civil rights movement as a period that was completed, which of course it has not been completed. But it was interesting to see this moment where very early stages of the movement where Daisy herself could only sense that she was part of something that was bigger than herself and that her family was being swept into it. Daisy Myers died in 2011, and when her obituary was published in the York Daily Record, they headlined it, "Daisy Myers, the Rosa Parks of the North," which isn't too far off. I mean, she was the first, and in as much the same way that Rosa Parks had been the first, in her case, to integrate housing development. Our second story focuses on the integration of the Highland Park swimming pool in Pittsburgh. And it's a good moment to talk about something about the history of segregation in the North. And when you think about segregation and you think of images, you're often drawn to things like public drinking fountains. In the South, you would have had ones marked whites, others marked colored. In the North, you did not find those types of signs because in the North, while there was a very different way of expressing and enforcing segregation. The South relied on Jim Crow laws. The North relied on custom and practice and legal loopholes. And the story of the Highland Park swimming pool illustrates all of those points. Where's the Highland Park swimming pool and why is it important? The Highland Park swimming pool is located in Pittsburgh in Highland Park, one of two fairly large municipal parks in the city of Pittsburgh. Highland Park became important for people in Pittsburgh, especially in 1931, because in addition to a zoo, the city decided to establish a swimming pool. There had been public swimming pools in Pittsburgh before 1931, but nothing like Highland Park. Why? Because Highland Park was big. When it was considered a resort-style pool with two large tanks. We have a color postcard here that shows the pool in the 1930s, gives you a sense of the scale. We also have a map that shows it located within the park. Both of these tanks were about the size of a football field. That's important. What's even more important is what that meant. It meant that the pool could accommodate, in the hot summer months, about 10,000 people a day. That's a lot. When Highland Park opened in 1931, there was a headline in a Pittsburgh newspaper that said, "City officials say Highland Park is open for all," and they emphasized for all. And it said that, at least on paper, but in reality, Highland Park was not open for all. And what happened was, even though this was a city-sponsored form of recreation or institution, in practice, African Americans who attempted to enter Highland Park, while they could get through the gates, were often escorted out. Those were the words. They were being escorted out by gangs of local youths who were intent on keeping Highland Park only for white residents of Pittsburgh. Why that gets even more interesting is in 1935, Governor George Earle signs a law called the Equal Rights Act in Pennsylvania, which strictly forbids racial discrimination in everything from movie houses and pool halls to pools. So there's a law on the books in 1935 that expressly prohibits racial discrimination, and yet racial discrimination and segregation is being practiced openly in Pittsburgh. And to me, this really illustrates the nature of segregation and what it relied on in the North compared to in the South. Even when you had laws on the books prohibiting it, those laws were only as good as the willingness of the authorities to enforce it. And the city of Pittsburgh's position was, we are allowing people to enter. We don't provide for their safety while they're there. That's not on us. And it was a cop-out, but that was their position. So that situation obtained from 1931 until about 1951. So for a full 20 years, Highland Park is effectively segregated. What changes? Well, a couple of things change. After World War II, you have a lot of African American veterans who return to the country that they had fought for, who can now see very plainly that the freedoms that they were fighting for abroad were being denied to them back home. And that was certainly the case for the head of the Urban League. His name was Alexander Joe Allen, and he is pictured in this exhibit. He is the head of the Urban League in Pittsburgh. He's also a World War II veteran. He also likes to swim. So what does Joe Allen decide to do? There are some pickets that form, and we have a photograph of folks picketing the city-county building in downtown Pittsburgh in an effort to end the practice. But it doesn't happen. That's not enough. So Joe Allen decides he's going to do what he thinks the law allows him to do, which is to enter Highland Park. He walks in, and he is immediately surrounded by a gang of white youth, and they escort him out. But instead of just walking home, he takes another step. He files a lawsuit. It's an important lawsuit because what he ends up, the folks he ends up suing is the city of Pittsburgh. And he makes the argument that the city is maintaining a public nuisance because the continued effort to maintain a segregated space, despite the laws that prohibit it, had caused a lot of tension because the neighborhood was adjacent, where Highland Park was located, was adjacent to a black neighborhood. So there were efforts ongoing that were amplified after World War II because of the interest in bringing that same notion of freedom that the veterans had fought for back home. And it really helped to energize the movement and the effort to dismantle segregation where it existed in people's own backyard, if you will. The second thing that happens is that in addition to Joe Allen pushing some legal work through that would put pressure on the city of Pittsburgh, is he's joined by another fellow named Reverend Leroy Patrick. We have a wonderful quote from Leroy Patrick at the top of this exhibit. Leroy Patrick takes a very different approach from Joe Allen. And what Leroy Patrick decides to do is to enter the pool, walk into the swimming pool with a small group of folks from his church. He's a pastor who's recently arrived in Pittsburgh from Philadelphia. That's an important point. Leroy Patrick wrote up his experience, much like Daisy Myers did, and his efforts to lead the desegregation of the Highland Park swimming pool in the summers of 1951 and 1952 through a series of what he called swim-ins. Now we think of sit-ins. Swim-ins are simply, the aquatic analog to that. So he has a small group that he takes into the pool. We have a photograph of a small group of both African Americans and whites from his church that just simply enter the pool and bear the taunts. There's a great quote from Leroy Patrick where he says, "Every white person left the water and began taunting us, and they filled it with so many stones they had to empty the pool." So there was a real effort to just stand their ground. The other thing I want to point out is the way we've been able to tell this story, and we have a wonderful photograph here. We have another wonderful photograph, a really large photograph elsewhere in the exhibit, of this small group of folks being led by Leroy Patrick, in the water, as crowds of whites are surrounding them, is because those photographs were taken by a fellow named Teenie Harris. Teenie Harris was a staff photographer for the Pittsburgh Courier. The Pittsburgh Courier was a black-owned newspaper. It was the only newspaper that really covered the integration effort in any kind of detail. Most of the main newspapers either ignored it or gave it very short shrift. So we've got a wonderful photograph here that we've enlarged showing a group of African American swimmers in Highland Park swimming pool. Another one over here. It's a story that, had it not been for Charles Teenie Harris and the work that he did, would have been lost visually, and we would have made it very difficult to kind of convey this story. So we're really grateful for that. What happens is that the twin effort of legal action and direct civil action work to turn the tide. And in 1951, during the first year of this effort, there's only 120 African Americans who are able to enter Highland Park swimming pool, but the following year, that number increases to 5,000. And so Highland Park really is the first domino to fall, and the city concedes and begins to supply a police presence at Highland Park to ensure the public safety of the African Americans who eventually are able to swim there. What happens after this is interesting, and it goes in a couple of different directions. Highland Park, interestingly enough, over time eventually becomes a black swimming pool. And the understanding is that many whites who were not in favor of integration simply choose to leave and go to private swimming facilities. And that's a big part of the story of the civil rights movement, is even where there were successes that always came with a kind of cost, and there's an argument whether or not integration was achieved even if desegregation was successful. We have a small homage here at the end of this section of the exhibit to Leroy Patrick, for whom this was the first of what would become a lifetime of campaigns to end racial segregation, racial inequality, racial injustice. And we have a series of buttons that he collected and medals attesting to his work in the civil rights movement in Pittsburgh after World War II. So our third story is the story of the integration of Girard College in Philadelphia. And when I've presented this story before, I've often talked about how the civil rights movement is also well known for a couple of landmark Supreme Court cases, and probably the most important one that we think of in the context of education is the 1954 ruling in Brown versus the Board of Education, which ended racial segregation, as we noted here on our main panel on public education. But again, it came with an asterisk. is that ruling did not apply to private colleges and private schools. Girard College was one of those private schools. Girard College was founded in 1848 in Philadelphia as a private residential primary and secondary school for orphan boys. For people in central Pennsylvania, which is where Harrisburg is located, they may think of a school like Hershey, the Milton Hershey School. Milton Hershey School is modeled on Girard College. So Girard College really kind of set the blueprint for these types of schools. And it was started by a fellow named Stephen Girard. Stephen Girard is not a household name today, but in the 1830s, he would have been very well known because he was the wealthiest man in North America, or so it was told. When he died in 1831, he left a sizable estate. And to his credit, he believed that that wealth that he had accumulated should go to the public good as he understood it. And we have a quote from him from his will that said, "I am particularly desirous to provide for such a number of poor male orphan children as can be trained in one institution, a better education as well as a more comfortable maintenance than they usually receive from the application of public funds." He has what is called a sense of noblesse oblige. There's a big asterisk, though. When I read that statement, I left out an important qualifier that he had included in his will: poor male white orphan children. Now, in 1831, that qualification would have caused very little concern among the people living, or most people living in Pennsylvania, because 1831, slavery is still a going institution in the South. There was no expectation that African Americans, if they were free, would be treated equally with whites. In Philadelphia in particular, had a free black population, but it was small. He builds, I should say, his estate, or those who managed his estate, end up building Girard College in a bucolic area of Philadelphia in 1848. And we have a wonderful copy of an original lithograph that shows the Girard College campus circa 1850, surrounded by trees, and surrounded, most importantly, on its 43-acre campus by a 10-foot wall with stone and gate. 43 acres. And it was just part of the scene, really important part of the campus. But as time goes on, that wall that is provisioned around Girard College when it opens ends up becoming a very important symbol of the racial exclusion that is literally baked in to Girard College. And in the 19th century, there are some very small and modest challenges to the exclusion of African Americans from admission to Girard College, but it doesn't really pick up any kind of speed until really after World War II. And by this time, Girard College, on its bucolic campus in North Philadelphia, is now home to a very large African American neighborhood. And that setting really provides the contrast needed to really take on this segregated institution in Philadelphia, which is receiving, importantly, some public support from the city of Philadelphia. Things really begin to change at this all-white school in 1964 when a fellow named Cecil B. Moore, who's pictured here, is elected president of the NAACP. Now, Cecil B. Moore is to say that an interesting character would be an understatement. He is a World War II veteran, not just a World War II veteran, a Marine. He's part of what's called the Montford Point Marines, the first group of African Americans to join the Marine Corps. He's a tough cookie. He uses his GI Bill after World War II to attend law school at Temple at night, and he opens up a private practice in North Philadelphia, serving many poor, almost all African-American clientele. He gets involved in politics, he's on city council, and then he takes over the NAACP. When he is elected to the president of the NAACP, he gives a speech, and he said, I've got a couple of priorities. My number one priority is going to be ending the practice of segregation at Girard College. And he said, this is an important institution that has been staring us in the face with its own brand of flagrant inequality. And he makes this comment, and he says, we have to take down this wall. And we're going to see that wall start tumbling down. So he really starts to kind of stoke the righteous rage at certain points in this institution that's practicing, openly practicing segregation. So he announces that there will be pickets of Girard College. And he sets up a series of public protests at the gates of Girard College beginning in May of 1965. This is really important because it shows a couple of different things that we haven't seen in our other stories. First of all, we have a very direct public pronouncement from Cecil B. Moore. He announces his intentions. This is not happening surreptitiously as it happened in Levittown. Secondly, he's announcing that this will be a mass protest. We've seen change occur with a family, with a small group. Now this is going to be a mass movement. Now again, we're now in 1965, we're not in 1957 or 1952. It's an important change in the movement, and you couldn't get a better person to lead this in terms of effectiveness than Cecil B. Moore. He is a leader of the civil rights movement in a very different fashion than someone like Martin Luther King, because Cecil B. Moore believes that you don't ask to be treated equally, you demand it. And that's the way he goes about this campaign. We have a couple of really interesting photographs here of the campaign, the protest over the course of 1965. What I think is interesting is, almost directly in response to Cecil B. Moore calling out the picketers, the city responds in kind by sending out a large phalanx of Philadelphia police officers. And we have a couple of photographs that show Philadelphia police officers lining the walls of Girard College. And what's interesting to me is somewhere in this photograph is a Frank Rizzo, a young Frank Rizzo, who at the time was a deputy police commissioner, really just starting to get into Philadelphia politics. He would later, of course, become the mayor of Philadelphia, controversial mayor certainly in the 1970s. But at this point, he is just a deputy commissioner, but he is part of this group that's called out by the city of Philadelphia, and he and Moore are clearly on opposite sides of this issue. Over the course of that summer, tensions escalate. A couple of the protesters scale the wall of Girard College, and we have a photograph of Cecil B. Moore getting those folks out of jail. He's a lawyer. He knows how the law works, and he's able to keep the protests going. In August of 1965, as the protest continues to try to stay together, Martin Luther King decides to visit. It's a really critical moment. He gives a speech in front of Girard College where he compares Girard College to a Berlin Wall in the birthplace of freedom. And it's a really powerful metaphor that he throws out there that I think really helps to solidify public support for this group that was really trying to change the policy at Girard College. The protest continues until December of 1965. It's the longest public protest that the city of Philadelphia had seen to that point. And then an important thing happens in December of 1965, which is another lawsuit is filed on behalf of 7 African-American boys who are denied admission to Girard College for the same reason that other African-American students had been denied admission, is because of the stipulation in the will. But in this case, what's different is that in addition to the mothers joining who filed the lawsuit, the city itself and the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania and the local NAACP joined the suit against Girard College. And it goes into litigation for about 3 years. So here we are in a simulated classroom inside Girard College. And obviously this is just an exhibition media that we use. A couple of things I want to point out is this is an aerial photograph of Girard College about 1948. And I think it really helps to underscore how much this school was effectively an island of segregation surrounded by an otherwise, very densely settled African-American neighborhood. And it really, that wall becomes kind of a moat that they're trying to protect. I think that's really interesting. And what we've done here, because it's hard to make legal history interesting, we've actually diagrammed out the court case, much like teachers used to diagram out sentences, and you can really understand the various iterations of the lawsuit. But really what we want people to understand is that in May of 1968, the Girard trustees vote to admit black students after the case going to the Supreme Court, which refused to hear the appeal of Girard College and affirmed the lower court decision to integrate Girard College. There's also a really interesting photograph that we have in this section of the exhibit that shows Cecil B. Moore pointing at a public rally, a victory rally in May of 1968 to 2 young boys. Those 2 young boys become the protagonists of the second part of this story, which we tell over in this section of the exhibit. So in September of 1968, Girard College admits its first class that includes African American students. There are 7 who are admitted following that 1965 lawsuit. 4 were admitted after the suit was finally settled 3 years later. So there were 7 in the original lawsuit, 4 were still around and of age that they could be admitted into the school. Eric Liddell Smith had, back in early 2000, was able to interview a couple of those students who were part of that first class, including Theodore Hicks and his brother Charles Hicks, who are pictured here with their mother. We have a wonderful quote from Marie Hicks, who said, I feel we are supposed to open this door to black boys. She's not per se involved in the civil rights movement. She's attending to the needs of her sons who had been orphaned, so qualify in every other way for Girard College except that they're African American. So she and her sons are part of that first group. Charles Hicks goes on to become the first black graduate of Girard College, and his brother becomes the first valedictorian, Ted Hicks. And we have here some of the materials from the Hicks brothers, who were kind enough to loan these to us, and we're also loaned them to Girard College as well. And it's an interesting part of the story because when we opened this exhibit, and I will share this anecdote from the opening exhibit in the summer of 2022, we had somebody here at the opening who was staring very closely at this photograph. And I asked him what he was seeing, and he said, "That's me." So almost just by happenstance, Carl Riley, who was part of that first group of 4, came to the exhibit this is part of this story, is this is not a distant past. It's still in very much a recent memory. This shows that he remembers this moment where he walked through those gates, walked into Girard College. And when we interviewed him and asked him about his experience, he said, I have mixed feelings. He said, I have to say that Girard College was incredibly important for me because the school was, and still is, very well endowed, has a lot of resources to draw on to provide students with a top quality education. He remembers going to Europe. He got into a great school. He thought that was wonderful. At the same time, they were alone. There were only a few African-American students there, and they were subjected to a certain level of harassment from the other students at the school. And that was tough. There's a wonderful quote from Charles Hicks, who again was the first black graduate of Girard College, where he said, if you start change, you're sort of by yourself. I don't think I want to be by myself too many times more. So that was enough for him. But it sort of tells that story about, even once desegregation is achieved, it doesn't always result in a full integration of an institution. And one of the things that's also important to note about Girard College is that today, and we have a final panel here where we talk about not only the original four who were part of the integration of Girard College, but we also talk about the school itself. Today, which would have been 2022, 94% of the school is African American. And so in some ways, Girard College has resegregated, and it's from all white to all black, but that is part of the story that we tried to tell without providing answers. Was integration achieved after successful desegregation? At the end of the exhibit, we have two things I just wanted to point out briefly. One is a wonderful sculpture of Martin Luther King, a bust of Martin Luther King, who was, of course, assassinated in April of 1968. And the sculpture was created by an artist named Oliver Legrone. It was donated to the Commonwealth in 1986 and is not part of our collection. We have a wonderful quote, I think, that really kind of sums up the exhibit in many ways. It's from one of Martin Luther King's many speeches. The phrase is, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. The second thing we have here is a timeline. And the timeline is divided between the top and the bottom. The top has a series of events that most people who've studied the civil rights movement or gotten a little bit of it in their high school or college history classes may know about. President Truman's order to end segregation in the military in 1948, the Brown ruling in education, Rosa Parks refusing to give up her seat in Montgomery, Alabama, black students barred from Arkansas High School in 1957, of course the March on Washington in 1963, all fairly well-known events. But what we've added to it are the events that we've shown here in this tour, which is Pennsylvania's equal rights law passed but unevenly enforced in 1935, black swimmers being taunted Highland Park swimming pool, 1951, and then successful access to the pool the following summer. In August of 1957, Pennsylvania State Police are dispatched to Levittown to protect the first black family and the second black family moving in the following summer. And then finally, in 1965, May, December, the NAACP organized protests outside of Girard College. In September of 1968, the first group of students to enter Girard College, black students entering Girard College. Our goal with this is to revise the understanding of the civil rights timeline to include these really important seminal events that occurred north of the Mason-Dixon line in Pennsylvania that were equally important to the struggle to achieve civil rights after World War II.
Listeners like you make PCN programming possible. Full episodes of PCN's history and culture content are available to stream with the PCN Select app. Explore other documentary programs, event coverage, and a lot more. To learn more about PCN's mission and to support PCN with a donation, visit PCNTV.com. This link and others can be found in our show notes. We appreciate your support.